How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.
Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, June the 23rd, a decade to the day from the Brexit referendum, and politics still in perpetual motion that's followed that. In less than a month, Britain will have its 7th Prime Minister, and anyone other than Andy Burnham would be a miracle. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico, up early today after a night of thunder and lightning over central London, and the weather god must be a Starmerite.
Yeah, I couldn't believe I woke up to a smattering of rain. I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. There's fleeting talk of opponents to Burnham and opponents of a coronation rallying round maybe Darren Jones, maybe Al Kearns. But I was out with Labour MPs last night, and few think that that's a serious prospect unless over the next 3 weeks, we're hit by some unknown unknowns. So all of that means that it looks like Andy Burnham will be our new Prime Minister on or about July the 17th, the first day of summer recess, after Parliament rises the day before. So, that's my best guess. I do wonder if the vacuum over the next 3 weeks until July the 9th, when nominations open, bring quite a lot of uncomfortable coverage of Andy Burnham sort of picking over everything he's ever said and ever done. But even so, it doesn't really feel like that even would throw Burnham off the current path that Labour MPs have set.
Agreed. It's Burnham and co. and some splutters of maybe, but not definitely, a contest. A Playbook reporting that the rumoured runner, Darren Jones, was seen hugging the Prime Minister at an emotional Downing Street garden party last night. Some of Jones's allies taking soundings on the theory that a battle of ideas is what Labour needs right now. That is a bit of a minority view. I think one Starmer supporting official probably has hit more where the mean and the median of the argument is when they told Playbook that manufacturing an argument in front of the country would now be the wrong call. The biggest conundrum with huge implications for the government and for the rest of us is who is going to be the next chancellor, and from there, quite what sort of economic policy he or she would pursue. We've got names, we've got a sense of the who and the what that Burnham is weighing up for you today.
Yeah, it was quite the moment yesterday as Andy Burnham took a black cab from Euston to Westminster, having travelled down from Manchester in the Avanti West Coast, of course, delayed. Sitting in that black cab with his all-female aides, figures who are going to become quite familiar to us in the future, Grace Pritchard, Abby Tomlinson. Supporters said that in the cab, as he wended its way to Westminster, he was calm. And there was that sense of transition yesterday. I don't know about you, Anne, but given that Keir Starmer resigned or announced that he was resigning as Prime Minister in a few weeks, sort of early in the morning, talk of Starmer sort of faded pretty quickly and the political water seemed to close over his head by about lunchtime. And we were looking to the future almost all day.
It's an unforgiving business, isn't it? Yeah, it was definitely, I left the north again, I travelled south again for Smith's fans out there. That was the journey we were watching all day, was Andy Burnham arriving. One noticeable moment was that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, wasn't in Downing Street for the resignation speech by Keir Starmer. Hours later, she was visible in a photo call with Andy Burnham after his swearing-in ceremony, starting his new life as an MP. And only a few cabinet ministers took the time or were around to stand in Downing Street and hear the Prime Minister's farewell and that rather long list of things he thought had gone very well. But they did include Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the PM, and personally very close to him, as well as David Lammy, the Deputy PM, Praetorian Guard, still there to the bitter end. The rest will be present at Cabinet at 9 a.m. today, and that will be, well, orcs, no?
Totally. I think, by the way, you mentioned Rachel Reeves. I think there's more of the story of how Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer's relationship ended to come out. It doesn't feel like it ended on a high, whether it was the Defence Investment Plan, whether I think it was reality hit her some weeks ago, maybe some months ago is my sense that it's over. I feel like that's not the united front between Prime Minister and Chancellor that you would want. And indeed, for all the public comments about, and, Team Starmer and Keir himself, and all the talk of the orderly transition. I was out and about last night, and there is a deep, deep reservoir of bitterness around the Labour Party, something of a poisonous undercurrent that I was picking up yesterday. It's MPs who are just sort of, already regretful that they've had to commit regicide, Tory-style staffers who are about to lose their jobs, MPs who picked a side and it turned out to be the wrong one. Out on the Commons terrace last night, there was champagne bottles, kind of mass drinking, bitterness and resentment in sort of equal measure. There was the vibe in the heat of a political party having a bit of a breakdown. It was like the guilty sort of tricketeurs after the execution having a party. It was it had the feel of something quite not very at peace with itself, shall we say?
Yeah, champagne, but a slightly bitter vintage. I think you're absolutely right about that undercurrent mood. Let's turn as well as number 10 and that aftermath to number 11 and the likely next incumbent. Still uncertainty about whether Burnham does dispense with Rachel Reeves and signals a new start for his chancellor. At the same time, a lot of senior city figures I've spoken to in the last few days shaking their heads and saying they will be a bit put out if she goes, unless they're very certain that they're going to get something better and steady. Worried about the reaction of the markets, but not just that, Sam. I think they're saying this transition has to be very clearly marked on growth, on a general kind of steadiness of demeanour and ability to put up with the slings and arrows that affect a chancellor. We saw Rachel Reeves struggle with that last year in the debacle over welfare reform and her moment in the Commons when she just clearly felt unable to cope with it. They want anti-inflation policies. They're concerned about that. And of course, pro-growth. So I was sitting while you were living it large on the Commons terrace. I was with Maurice Glassman, the Blue Labour guru and peer, my neighbour at the Arc dinner, that kind of right-wing dinner led by Paul Marshall and his teams. And Maurice Glassman said this to me, and he did clear the quotes to use on the podcast. He said, God had a plan for Andy Burnham, and it was to put him in Makerfield as MP. I said, why was that? And he said, because it's pro-Brexit, it's culturally conservative, and overwhelmingly it thinks rejoining the EU is a very bad idea. And he went on, Sam, to tell me that he thought Makerfield gives Burnham a reality check, his words, on understanding the country, walking back any ideas that Burnham might have had in the past about rejoining the EU, and essentially prodding him in a much more blue Labourish direction. And we also talked about who the best replacement for Reeves might be. And he came up with an idea I hadn't heard, but I thought was an interesting one. Could the answer be John Healey? Until recently, Defence Secretary, who had, of course, a bus stop with Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer and the Treasury. So he's been benched ever since. He's benched himself, but he does know the Treasury from a previous job there. And he would be a reassuring figure. What do you reckon?
I think that's a fascinating suggestion. And to, completely hands up, I'm not able to solve the conundrum who's going to be the next Chancellor because there are two different paths. I would say about John Healey, a cynic might point out that he absolutely couldn't make the sums add up at the Ministry of Defence. But, wisecracking won't really cut it because I can't really see a path yet. There are two widely perceived frontrunners, right? Ed Miliband, who is literally making calls, sort of sounding people out about cabinet jobs on behalf of Andy Burnham, and is clearly central. He's been, as we've talked about before, he has been giving economic advice to Andy Burnham during this campaign. His campaign team is Andy Burnham's campaign team. Figures like Grace Pritchard, communications chief, worked for him. He's absolutely central to this project. So he is one sort of obvious and key figure, but he would mark quite a big departure from Rachel Reeves. And that's where some of the kind of nerves around that you were talking to with your city contacts do come into play, I think. The other assumed frontrunner sort of popped up yesterday. That's Wes Streeting. Now, we know that about an hour after Keir Starmer resigned, Wes Streeting folded his own leadership campaign and threw in his weight behind the King of the North, Andy Burnham. And I was very struck that his letter specifically talked about, just how his views on prosperity aligned with those of Andy Burnham. So it sort of looked like a hint that he was bringing, parts of his philosophy into line with the next prime minister. But it's far from clear that is enough for them to work together. And of course, the Burnham campaign would deny that any jobs have been handed out, and would absolutely deny that anything's a done deal. And what do you make of Wes Streeting as a prospect as well?
Wes Streeting certainly sounding very interested in remits beyond his old health beat. You and I have spotted on this podcast that he's taken to having views about infrastructure funding in the detail, very growth-facing topics, fun party topics. Not everyone finds Streeting a completely reassuring figure. It was just a word that I found myself using quite a lot this morning, because I think this is something that people are going to be looking for, particularly in the business community, with this shake-up. And he can seem to be at his best in his very zesty, almost permanent campaign mode. He does like to stir things up, and he certainly did with his early resignation, one of the bricks out of the wall for Keir Starmer. One detail someone mentioned who'd known him for years, since his NUS days, he said, look, Wes is best at selling uncomfortable reforms, as he did with tuition fees as a lad, to folk on the left. He likes that kind of going across the lines role. But Chancellor is also a place where you need a degree of steadiness and of delivery. And I just wonder whether that would end up being Wes Streeting, but it's perfectly plausible. There's Pat McFadden, definitely would stand for steadfast. Some Treasury mandarins I was with at the weekend thought that he would be very good, though Maurice Glassman said that he had heard that Pat McFadden had some very tough plans ahead to go back to welfare reform on his terms, and that he'd like to stay in post, and that he thinks that this is something he wants to push through. He seems to sort of indicate as much also himself at a party, just on the fly. Shabana Mahmood at the Home Office, well, she is said to want to stay there, but if the Prime Minister asks you to do something and thinks you're the right signal in one of the top offices of state, it's hard to resist. And John Healey would be a daring choice and a sign of toughness and grit, but we do know what he would splash out on. And you did point that out, Sam, it would be defence.
Yeah. I thought you made really interesting points about Wes Streeting. It makes me recall there is a lot of bad blood that involves him, if I'm being honest. Never has a speech caused more ongoing strife than that December 2024 Spectator Parliamentarian of the Year speech by Streeting, where he savaged Louise Haigh and basically mocked her. She'd just been sacked over that business involving her phone. Louise Haigh, now the by-election mastermind, as far as I can tell, probably the single most important person around Andy Burnham right now. So maybe Wes Streeting picked the wrong target. But I mention that because, it was only a few weeks, it was definitely this year, that another ally of Andy Burnham's was absolutely savaging Wes Streeting over that speech. I think I even brought it up on the podcast a sort of day or two after. The dislike of how he humiliated Louise Haigh had not been forgotten a good 14 months on. And that incident and that perception that you rightly point out of perpetual campaigning, and that tone in the letter that sort of almost implied that he knew what part of the government he might end up in, having done the decent thing and folded behind Andy Burnham. I do think that there's a bit of sort of team streeting that can come across as presumptuous. As for the other names, friends of Mahmood say she's determined to stay. The Times put her in the Home Office on Friday, now put her back in the possible Chancellor camp this morning. I think we really don't know. One more name. I actually wonder about Louise Haigh herself, I mean, at the moment, I think allies think she might end up in the cabinet office, but there is something of the joint political project with Andy Burnham that you can see. And, she was the author of that pamphlet just before the leadership contest on fiscal rules. And she would align quite closely with Andy Burnham because, she's the one that's masterminding so much of this. So I just did wonder about that. But we will see.
I think there'd be a lot of caution about that, partly on grounds of experience. She does have a corporate governance background in insurance, in all fairness, but she has been on the left of the economic debate and in general very associated with the soft left. How much does Burnham want to lean into that for his chancellor? I think that would certainly be a bracing wind through the city of London. Let's not forget Ed Miliband shaping up, as you mentioned, Sam, to be very influential and certainly a force in cabinet. But we know that there's quite a pushback against that, particularly, I think, in more conservative circles. So they think that would absolutely nail on the fact that Andy Burnham is red in tooth and claw. So does he just say, look, I'm going to style this one out because I trust Ed Miliband's experience? And it is also fair to say, if you go to people who are in energy transition, things like the fusion program, which is quite a big deal, as one of the big, more adventurous things the UK is out there and doing. They're not so nervous about Ed Miliband because they think he understands energy quite well. They might disagree with some of his policies, but I think more broadly in the city that would go down quite badly. More certain is that Jim O'Neill, the ex-Goldman Sachs advisor, Northern powerhouse minister under the Cameron government, is set for a major role, probably as chief economic advisor to the Burnham government. Though you do think, actually, why not, wild card choice for chancellor, because he has had a bit of ministerial experience, but it's still a crowded field, that one, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, and we're all hunting for clues about what Burnham's economic policy looks like and the kind of reboot of economic ideas that could get us out of the sort of doldrums that we're in at the moment. So as part of that Manchesterism film that we put out over the weekend, I spoke to Jim O'Neill. The interview was about 2.5 weeks ago. So that was before he was confirmed as an advisor and therefore a little bit more free to speak than he is right now. And actually, the interview, inevitably, in the way that these things work, was quite a lot longer than the bits that we used in the film. But now Jim O'Neill is front and centre. Hearing him go into quite a lot of the specifics about what he thinks might be a good idea suddenly becomes massively more relevant. So I thought I'd just play you the sort of extended, Jim O'Neill Redux director's cut version of the interview. And forgive me, it's about 2 minutes long, which I know is long in this podcast terms. But you won't hear anything as detailed as what you're about to hear about the direction of travel that he wants to push a Burnham government in. So listen to this.
On the specifics, and this relates to something I've tried to encourage this government to be bolder about, I think the second part of the fiscal rule on borrowing to invest, I think that could be explored a lot more and not in a way that freaks out the financial markets, especially if what I hoped for the emergence of what's now called NISTA, this combination of the old Infrastructure Commission with the Infrastructure Delivery Authority, that's been put together and it's now another division of the Treasury. What I'd like to see, and I think what Andy might explore, is a much more publicly transparent entity like that, a sort of infrastructure version of the OBR, in which the whole country can see regularly, transparently, what big infrastructure projects are going to make a difference and what ones won't, to get away from this very personal, subjective view. I love HS2, I hate HS2, and so on. And you've got to have that kind of clarity and transparency in order to pull off many aspects of what Andy appears to be hinting at.
But does he have that clarity of vision? That's a big, bold thing to rip up the fiscal rules. He said he's not going to do it.
I don't think he'd necessarily have to rip up the fiscal rules.
But change
I think
them.
you just need to be bolder about borrowing to invest. A lot of people right now, given Britain's history for 30 years or more, think any kind of borrowing just means wasted money. But if you borrow for things that have really positive multiplier effects, my own subjective example would be, I'll give you two. One would be for Northern Powerhouse Rail, which I've always thought way more important than HS2, but let's see what the real experts say transparently. And secondly, things like investing in preventive health issues as opposed to treating that like everything else. And I think if that's done in a really powerful way, it would make investors think the country's growth trend can genuinely be boosted.
So to recap specifically, that's an infrastructure commission that would stop politicians cancelling big projects like HS2 and more borrowing specifically. And this is the thing that he names that we didn't get in the film, but you can hear in that excerpt. He names it would be for Northern Powerhouse Rail and for health transformation. So that's where he's coming from. Final point from me. Yesterday we had this head of the CBI on Sky, Rain Newton-Smith, and I asked her about, just in principle, more borrowing. And do you know what? And she didn't fall off her chair. Like, she said, look, the important thing is that you have it all needs to be done in the context of a proper plan. So let's see. But, none of that easy. But there's a huge number of tricky things in the in-tray. I know you want to raise the subject of Europe, and what's going on there? The summit's been cancelled.
Oh, Sam, the best laid plans of mice men and Europe ministers. Nick Thomas Symonds was gridded for a Downing Street press conference this morning to talk about the still inconclusive terms of the July summit as intended to reconnect the UK to the EU, on which I have become tragically something of a mastermind level expert, though this knowledge may or may not turn out to be useful, because that is now all off till September at the earliest, given the need for a new boss to come in to Number 10 and set out a stall. And I think what the Cabinet Office and the team working on this very hard and grinding away that relationship with Maroš Šefčovič, the chief negotiator on the EU side, one has to give, I think, Nick Thomas Symonds some credit for the late nights on that one. They were hoping to get this deal broadly done. A source there telling me for a piece I contributed to by my colleague, largely John Stone, on all of this, that it's constitutionally tricky for both sides to have a new PM agree to negotiations that finished under a previous PM. But in truth, the summit was postponed very abruptly by the EU side yesterday. And it's a reminder that in this situation, we started saying 10 years after Brexit today, we are very much the demandeur in the language of Brussels here. We're the ones asking for something. And the bigger question is, for Andy Burnham, how long or how far he sticks with those self-imposed political limits on discussing closer EU alignment in more concrete terms, like something like the customs union, even if it's short of rejoin. Does he try to really go out there and stir up some feathers on that one? If he wants to go in a different direction, I think there's an element of the EU thinking, well, let's just see the cut of his jib before we sign up to things about youth mobility and bits of agricultural product stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Politics is changing pretty fast. The best case scenario for Andy Burnham, though, is not getting into the weeds of the customs union. It's being a politically astute Prime Minister who can tonally deal with the country at a point where actually the main challenger, reform, looks ever so slightly to be having a difficult time and just slightly fraying at the edges, not just the Makerfield by-election, but the troubles involving Nigel Farage and all the rest of it. And you're off to interview Robert Jenrick this morning, so I'm quite interested to hear tomorrow how he thinks reform are doing, and after that bloody nose in Makerfield, and just whether he acknowledges at all any sense of shifting sands.
Yes, there is life in other parties, not only in the over-eventful Labour Party. So I'm looking forward to putting Robert Jenrick through his paces later today, and we'll have something about that on the podcast tomorrow.
There won't much life left for us if we go much further beyond our 20 minutes. So thank you very much indeed for joining us and the birds in my garden, which made a very sonorous appearance this morning. Apologies for that if that was a distraction. We'll see you tomorrow.
They are listeners. We like listeners.
How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.